There he is.
I'm here. Hello.
Hello.
Good to see you. I figured if I picked the topic, I shouldn't show up.
Yeah, just throw it to us.
That's right. Get it out of the way. I don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, I think I know what you mean by this topic, Kevin, but I'm curious to hear what you'll say.
All right, so I should introduce
how
it.
you'll direct it.
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay, let me introduce the topic then. So basically, this is something that's come up recently in a video I watched and has kind of been a thing on stream. We've talked about it a little bit, but basically, like, a lot of people think that games can't be designed certain ways, or certain elements of games can't be done anymore because we've somehow evolved, right? Like, gamers have evolved, communities have evolved in such a way that prevent us from doing game design, certain kinds of game design. And so one of those is, Discord or other third-party social apps. Like, we've always had like third-party socialization with websites or forums or things like that. We've had that for a long time, but Discord is like takes it to a new level. So the speed of information, the speed of communication, like memes travel really fast. Everything else travels really fast, like knowledge, etc. So, but also just like socialization, it's handled outside of games in a lot of cases now, and the speed of everything, it just has ramped up. So the question or the topic tonight is, how does that affect game design moving forward? Is it true that we can't do certain types of things anymore because these things exist? Or can we start leveraging, the new norm in fun ways in terms of game design? And are some games already doing this moving forward into the future? So what does the landscape look like when it comes to like social engagement and social interaction, because things like Discord exist?
Can you give me your best argument of like a game that Discord has, or an experience that Discord has prevented or made more difficult? Are we talking kind of like data mining, just to zoom out, because I feel super unfamiliar with this? Like, information spreads too fast, so there are no mysteries, is kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, so I'll give you
Okay.
one of the concrete examples that I brought up, and this is something we've talked about a lot, and this is actually even before Discord existed. But Ultima Online, the experience of Ultima Online, that's a game that, if you guys remember, had, and for those that didn't, it had an element where you could teleport anywhere. If you went to a place, you could mark a rune or create a teleport destination spot and then teleport to that place instantly from anywhere in the world. And you had unlimited runes. Like, as long as you had been there and marked a rune, you could put a bunch of them in your bank, and you could teleport to everywhere within 3 seconds. And so that place, in terms of like game world, right, or travel time, things were instant. Essentially, you could be anywhere. But what wasn't instant was communication. So you had local chat only, essentially, and you didn't have things like Discord or Vent or anything else, like where you were speaking with people outside the game. If you wanted to talk to somebody, you had to say something within the game, in a say, not even in a tell or a private message or in guild chat, because they didn't have any of that. And so, and then whoever was there to hear it was there to hear it. Like, you couldn't really have private conversations. And what that allowed for was like events to breathe. It allowed for things to develop in a very natural way. So, and like the example is, if I kill a guy, if I PK a guy, in a dungeon, word doesn't travel fast to that guy's buddies to come and stomp me down, until much later. So it has a natural time to sort of progress and allow for that event to occur with sort of out repercussion for a much longer time than what we have nowadays. Like, in the sense of World of Warcraft, in today's light with Discord, it would be, I kill a guy, he tells everyone in his Discord channel that he got killed. Everyone instantly teleports to that location because they have a mark for that place. and I'm killed within a few minutes, right? And so Discord, in a lot of ways, or just the speed at which people communicate to their team and their buddies, prevents that kind of experience from like playing out more naturally and at a slower pace. And so what I've felt is that what we have to do now in environments to have things play out more naturally is to increase travel time, because communication time is so ramped up. In order to create a natural experience like the ones we had in Ultima Online, you'd have to increase travel time so that these places were secluded, and it took time to respond to them in a totally different way. And obviously, adding tons of travel time to things, players are like, "Ooh, that's gross." Like sounds like a lot of downtime and no fun. Um, and we sort of had a mix of that, like in the World of Warcraft example, because communication was ramped up, but we also had a lot. The travel time was a lot more limited than it is, nowadays, right? Because you get on your flying mount and you fly over to a place really quickly. So if a world boss is up, like you can get there much quicker than you used to be able to. So anyway, that's an example of, has Discord closed off that space where things can occur more naturally, without much quicker response times everywhere, so that things like what happened in Ultima Online can't really happen again.
Yeah, and I think, to add to this a little bit also as well as another context, the one that system designers talk a lot about in this thinking is there actual real choice anymore? With Discord,
Right.
with player communities, with theory crafting, with simulations that people make, and what kind of choices can you add to games with the power of communities, mapping out a lot of decision making in games, right? And even on the systems team at Blizzard, we hired people who were theory crafters, who were simmers, and brought them onto the team to help us, contribute to balance and things like that. And it's like a whole new world we live in. Yeah.
Right. And so, can we escape that, or what do we have to do to leverage its power to make games better?
I have so much to say. How do I? Okay. Oh, I'm so excited. Okay, this is the best topic ever. Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah.
Because I think, first of all, to organize my thoughts, because I'm giddy. It's important to both acknowledge the speed at which people can communicate, but also the speed at which they can readily get information. Like the age of the internet, nothing's a mystery anymore. And I think we could tackle both of those topics. But before I do any of this, before we peel back the layers of the onion, I would love to date myself for just a fucking minute. Kevin, did you play EverQuest?
Yes.
Did you ever take part in what was known as a phone tree, my friend?
No.
So a phone tree was the best. So there wasn't Ventrilo back in the day.
There wasn't. You had ICQ, right?
Yeah, there was, but you didn't guarantee you had everybody, because your guilds were 75, 80 people.
Yeah,
and it was kind of expected. People used those mediums to communicate with their friends mostly, or to talk in weird chat channels for strangers. So there was this notion that when something important to the guild happens, such as a world boss spawning, right?
Right.
That there was someone who would know, you would find out that something happened, and you'd have two guildmates that you were supposed to call on the telephone, because calling on the telephone costs money, right? Nobody lives in the same place. There were no cell phones back then that had free, US calling in the US or whatever. And so everybody had their two buddies or three buddies in the guild that they were supposed to call and say, "Hey, Yellonak is up." And then when it sets away, it's a tree, because you call your three, so-and-so calls their three, and suddenly everybody knows that the boss is up and they need to log in. So, I'm not you're wronging this, that it didn't exist, that Discord was a thing, but it wasn't very common to have a phone tree, but oh my God, do I remember being part of a phone tree.
Right. That's awesome.
My mom being who are you calling in Georgia?
Right. That's right. The phone bill is full of Georgia calls, right?
And I was 13 at the time, so
yeah. And some of us had forums that you'd try to keep up with, or you had IRC channels, that you would drag over, to look to see if anything was updated. So we did have sort of Stone Age communication methods. But yeah, the speed of everything is just ramped up. The technology's gotten so much better.
Right, you had a good chance. If you had a guild like phone tree, you had a very good chance of beating everybody else because they simply couldn't get the message fast enough that something was up, and you need 75, 100 people to kill it.
Yeah.
So that's like thing one. Thing two is I think that games can preserve that, but players. Sorry. Let's go to the internet spoiling everything. Not quite just the speed of communication, but like an example is World of Warcraft, right? The right way to play the game, if you are doing raid content, is to read the guide first, or to watch the video, such that it's almost expected in the community that you're not going to show up, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. Let's learn this fight together. Like learning the fight together is something you have to opt into, and some groups do that. They don't. They have their own like weird boundaries when it comes to guides on the internet. Like, oh, we'll look at this, but we won't do their strategy. Or,
Yeah.
Like they have their own player like policing. So
it's my dream guild, by the way. If anybody's recruiting, it's my dream guild right there. So
it's like not reading the internet, just sort of like letting yourself have a good time. And I think that Valheim is a good example of a game that does that pretty well. Like in WoW, a lot of people would rather just read the guide, but at an exploration game like Valheim, one, reading the internet is not that effective because it doesn't tell you like you need to go to this place and do this thing. It's more high level, right? Like you need to be in the plains and you need to find a thing or whatever, which really, really helps. Obviously, like the procedural generation nature of the game obfuscates the direct guide on exactly what to do, but people still make guides, like here's the most optimal way to get to a porcupine or like whatever.
Yeah. So Valheim's a really good example, and it's one I've used in the past to say, see, people are still hungry for this type of experience, because how many people have come from WoW, which I get a lot of people on my channel about, and have loved Valheim, and what they haven't done is read all the guides before diving into Valheim, right? But Valheim's also kind of unique because it came out of nowhere. Like nobody was expecting it for 18 months beforehand and had data mined the hell out of it or anything like that. So it came out of nowhere, but it also proved that people are hungry for that kind of exploratory, discovered experience. So I'm glad you brought that up, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think, and the last thing I was going to say is kind of like the spin on this, where as a game developer, I kind of hate the fact that people will just go to the internet and solve the mystery. But then also as a gamer, and as a game developer, there are some things that Discord enables. So like in World of Warcraft, there's these puzzles that are just so obfuscated. They're just so hard to figure out. Like it's not expected that one person is going to figure it out. You need to know like the initials of some character, and then you need to try to put it in some door, or like there's no communication, there's no messaging, and there's a whole Discord called the Secrets Discord that try to figure these things out, and it'll take them months to do it. And it's a huge cooperative experience.
Yeah. And did anyone play Secret World? Because I feel like Secret World tried to do some of this, and I didn't play it, unfortunately.
No, I mean, I played it to max level, but I don't remember doing any community engagement like that.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the Secrets group is actually a really good topic to talk about. Maybe we can expand on that later, but it's kind of, that is an example of a subsystem created with this environment in mind. That you're conceding that players will data mine, they will kind of collaborate and try to figure things out collectively.
Right.
And that whole system is kind of created for that kind of community, right? And so, yeah, that's a really good example, Candace. But I did want to say, like, comment on Valheim a little bit, and I do agree with you. It's a different experience. You don't really going into it kind of like reading up a lot of online guides with it. But I think the reason why is because the motivations for the player are different.
Yeah.
In an MMO and WoW in a competitive game, you're competing with every other player, and your rank, your kind of standing among the community is really important to you and to your performance and to your kind of enjoyment out of the game. And so there's no real kind of like compelling reason. I mean, some players will min-max even in Valheim, right? But the draw or kind of the like forces to cause the player to do that are different, you know?
So yeah, I wanted to posit that there are the two that I have identified, which is I'm very curious to what you talented developers also think, but the two things that I identified about Valheim that kind of preserved that willingness to figure something out yourself. And I hadn't even thought about the fact that it didn't get hyped up before it got shipped, which is fucking brilliant, by the way. That's totally a piece of it. But one is that your community is really small in that game, and it's really easy to be the smartest person in the room. So you don't feel like you need to go be smarter.
Right.
If that makes any sense. There's only like maybe 10 of you playing. And when you go and you find where silver ore comes from, you get to go tell everybody, like, yeah, I found this thing. And not everybody has already, like, I don't know. It's kind of like whenever, I don't know, in high school, like, you only had to be cooler than the coolest person at your high school. You didn't have to be the coolest person in the world, like Instagram influencers have to be now. And so I think there's an element of like social scale that preserves that integrity, not the integrity, but kind of like you don't feel obligated to go read up on something before you do it, I guess.
Yeah. So yeah, that leads to a great question: is can game design affect that outcome by sort of walling off smaller communities to not care about the larger community, the meta community, if you will? Like each group is more isolated in terms of what they're trying to do and accomplish, and their accomplishments matter more, on an insular level. Or is that a thing like an MMO can't achieve just by the basic notions of, no, you're amongst thousands of players, and so they impact you and you impact them? Is that only a thing that can be done in smaller scale games where your community is 10 people large?
I think so to answer your question, I have thought about this a fair amount. I think to answer your question, no, I don't think so. If it's an MMO, if it's a competitive online multiplayer game, you basically are in a new world now where you have to factor in this whole dynamic of players being able to re-engineer everything in the game within weeks of you implementing it, and you just have to account for that. So it does limit some things you can do for sure, but I think you can work around it, right? And I think WoW is a good evidence of this. If you think about the Covenant system recently, a lot of the talk in the beginning was, it's only like a 2%, 3% differential between different choices. Don't worry about it. Choose whatever you like. But players don't think that way, right? Like WoW is a game with a culture of min-maxing, and all basically competitive multiplayer online games are that way. And so you have to kind of, basically the old world was essentially the same by the same rules. It was just a lot harder for the players to really gauge whether they were optimal or not. Like in D2, for example, when you created a barb or a wizard or whatever it was, a lot of players built that character based on an online guide, even though like you said, the community kind of impact back then was a lot lower than it is today. Like the min-max culture has always existed. It's just today it's a lot easier to figure out what's optimal and what's not. And so there's a lot more pressure for system designers to be either razor accurate with the balance, or in my view, the other option, the better option, this is something Dota does, is instead of creating a lot of adjacent choices that are basically the same thing, like 3% haste or 3%, damage, which is, you can math out the best, option there. Instead, create conditional choices. For example, you can build out a character that is glass cannon, so you sacrifice a meaningful amount of health for more damage, or a choice of, well, I could choose a CC, or I could choose a lot more like jungle farming or whatever it is in Dota. And you make that choice on conditions of what the other team composition is and what your team composition is. And so there's always choices, but they're never going to be a one right choice. There are always different choices based on the situation. And I think that's what system designers need to do in the future, is design conditional choices, not like, you can't just throw out napkin math choices and hope for the best.
Yeah, it's not the target dummy condition, it's the content relevant decision, and the content is varied and tossing tons of different challenges at you, then that changes the context in which you make your decisions on how to solve those problems.
If I can ask though, doesn't that just, sorry, and I'm not trying to be diminutive at all. I'm actually curious. Does that just mean that you're obfuscating the answer so much that the answer is unknowable by the internet?
Not necessarily, right? Because like a simple example is, I'm going to be fighting elementals, right? So I bring my good elemental stuff. So that's an obvious thing for a lot of players, right? And then, the choice next to it is, something that's anti-undead or really good against undead. So as you switch from one content dungeon to another, you're making obvious choices, but, the context is changing. So there's a good and bad depending on the context. But then people can't say, that elemental choice is so dumb, it's so bad, because it's obviously not bad in the case where you're fighting elementals. So it's never like the target dummy scenario where all that matters is, your parse against a very static environment that never changes.
I see. Because I get that. So it's almost like providing enough. So game designers need to provide enough contextual environments to give the agency back to the player.
Right. And I think you run into the what you were suggesting before with your question is actually more true in a case where it is the target dummy thing, because the system designer seems like he gets into this mode of like, well, I have to make this really hard to figure out so that the process of discovering which one is better is fun, right? But it's like the few people on the planet that can actually figure it out either have to be able to create a really good sim program, or they have to be like elite level mathematicians to be able to, parse it out themselves.
Yeah,
rather than just kind of making it really obvious. I'm fighting elementals, we'll take the anti-elemental thing.
Yeah, that's why I was going to push back on that idea. It's exactly where I was going. I was thinking that if you make it so obfuscated, then you're not inviting anybody to make that decision for themselves. You're inviting the community to make a website to determine it for you, yada, yada.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it removes
sometimes
fun of that process.
I think what Chris said earlier is actually, like, it hits the nail on the head. I both disagree and I vehemently agree, where he said that WoW is a competitive environment. Mm-hmm. And so to stay competitive, you need to be on top of your game. And it made me realize that even if you're not PvPing, you're still competing with the other, random people on your server to get into a guild. You're competing to be in the friend space that you're in right now.
Right.
And often in the more competitive the environment, the more you feel like you have to be one step ahead, and you have to basically cheat by going to the internet, right? Like, you didn't figure out your gear sim yourself. You went on the internet, you equipped yourself with that information, you min-maxed, and now you belong in with that crowd. So, and that made me think, actually, when the environment isn't competitive, you don't see people going to the internet. Yes. And what I mean by that is LFR strict players. My mother-in-law is one of them. She will literally never open a website to find out how to do a boss. Right. She doesn't even know how to do it. She's like in her early 60s. but she will.
What's her boot rate?
What's her Raider.io?
No, what's her percentage of time she's been booted out of groups?
In dungeons, every single time. She and her husband just solo, or they duo old content dungeons, because that's what they like to do, and that's where they don't get booted. But what I mean is, like, that player who doesn't understand that she's in competition with everybody else on the server won't look ahead because she doesn't need to, right? And so you find the people, the LFR style crowd, are actually the people who didn't read up on the fight. But then you get booted from a group the first time, and they tell you should have read up on the fight or whatever. Right. And then then it becomes the culture of the game, which is really interesting about what Chris was saying.
Yeah, I mean, the culture is a really good point too, because it's important not to discount the culture of min-maxing in that community in a game. There's a segment of players who love kind of theory crafting and trying to figure out what's optimal, and that's like a game within a game for them.
Absolutely.
And other players like living in a game where that exists. They think the game is interesting, has a lot of depth, and they also like knowing that they've done their homework and that they have an edge on other players who aren't as studious or looking that stuff up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is me. Like 100%. I enjoy going and simming gear to a degree. Like I enjoy sort of knowing that I know how things are working under the hood and what to go after. I mean, in vanilla, I think there was this vast, open, adventurous time of the game where no one really knew anything. But then once it came time to raiding, I remember discovering elitist jerks and understanding like mechanics of how I was going to deal more damage with weapon speed normalization and shit it was like this electric moment of like, wow, I can really be a better player overall, and this is the thing that a lot of people aren't going to do. And that was a fun avenue for me. It didn't really like suck all the magic out of the game. It just kind of shifted the thing that I was excited about.
Yeah, for sure. And then, but I do believe that game design can steer culture in a lot of ways, and it can steer it in multiple ways as well. Because one of the things I worry about retail is that it's sort of the design has catered to only that play style, and so the culture has developed to embrace that and continue with that and embolden that. Whereas like I'm trying to imagine and I think they even have this, don't they? It's some Chris can probably correct me, but like a fashion contest, right? Where it's like every week instead of the raid, it's like no, there's actually pretty deep, cosmetic rewards for having a fashion contest, and the min max in that environment is totally different, and it's a total, it's not a numbers thing, it's not a math thing, it's a style thing, it's a subjective thing, and you're competing in a different way, and it's attracting a totally different audience, and the reward structure is designed to support what those people care about, and the play patterns are developed around supporting that. And so it's going to because of this competition, it's going to steer a lot of people in totally different directions, and then those cultures are going to meet potentially, because it's like there's going to be people in the dungeons going for loot to make their character better, and then there's going to be people that are going into the dungeons so they can get a weird cosmetic piece to perfect their attire for that week, right? And then those groups can find each other, hopefully, because they're both sizable. So the people that care about the cosmetic runs aren't necessarily grouping with the people that are going for rate and speed and all that kind of stuff. And then they can both have a good time in the dungeons because they're after different things and they play the game in different ways. And so that's like all it would take was somebody, it seems like a designer creating and thinking about that aspect of that whole environment and how to support that experience and to get that community and that culture growing.
I think we take way too much either credit or onus on ourselves for this kind of environment, though. And what I mean by that is, example, I could manipulate the game such that I could lean really far into the people who don't like to raid, or the people who really like the style aspect of the game, right? Mm-hmm. So you could make more opportunities for those people to find each other that aren't in dungeons and raids, right? Like you could make the rare spawn boss that you could just sit around and wait for, and he drops the really rare looking piece of loot or something. And the kind of people you'll see gathered around that are the people that value a cosmetic piece of loot, right? Mm-hmm. And so we think that we have control over this as designers, and by placing incentives and by carefully crafting our game into an environment that will create a culture.
Right.
I just keep coming back to this culture idea, because before the age of information, when you think about the Everquest days, that culture did bleed into WoW until there were websites that had boss strategy guides. Like there was an age in WoW when you beat a boss for the first time, even if you released a YouTube video, which YouTube was in its infancy in 2006, 2007, whatever, it was looked down upon to do a strategy video. It would always have to be like an artistic, like mashup to a piece of music or something that was just it was like a brag piece, like a sizzle reel, but it actually was really frowned upon to share your strategy. They were coveted, and that's still World of Warcraft. That's still the game that we're playing right now that also has the culture that has now developed into, bro, you should already know the answer to this fight. And of course, that does come from the cultural shift from the people going from EverQuest to World of Warcraft, influencing the culture. But that's why I think that the culture is more important than the incentives or the design of the game.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's like out of control, or like the designers can't manipulate it, or they shouldn't manipulate it?
I think that designers can manipulate it. I just don't know how effective we have been in the past in trying to manipulate our own culture instead of just sort of having a culture happen, like the battle royale culture just happened. Like the game was not meant to be a battle royale when it shipped. There was this thing where people realized they liked having short session elimination games, and then Fortnite was made, right? And that goes to show that like the successful model for making video games will be to make a lot of games that are built in like an engine that you're just adding tech to constantly, so that you can very quickly crank out new games and new features. I think that's like actually going to be the secret of making games in the future, is like just having a huge tech database, not database, but like always adding to an engine, even if you're failing and making games, so that you can make a game really quickly. But anyway, that's like a whole second subject. But to answer your question, I think that we can try to influence the culture, but I've not seen any successful examples of this, or I'm not aware of them. So if you can think of any.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends also what you mean by influence. I mean, I do think the designers have some agency or some way of architecting or engineering the culture based on extrinsic motivators they place in the game, right? But and so I do think that is an aspect. But in terms of like culture, in terms of like progression, I mean, there's always been some conversations I would have with other system designers who are just like trying to advocate that, well, not all players care about a progression. Not all players care about upgrades or having higher damage or whatever. And I would always question that because, progression is an innately human thing. Like we care about improving. We care about being promoted. We care about, keeping up with the Joneses. We care about getting better, improving my recipe for cooking. It's ingrained in us in a very human level. And so, and anything you do, I mean, there used to be this joke where people would be like, I'm competitive. I'm a competitive camper or whatever. I compete with everything. You know what I mean? And so, I don't know if you can really rub out that culture from a game unless, in terms of like kind of what you were talking about, Kevin, and with like the costume contests or whatever, like the Asmongold does or whatever. I think adding those things in the game is good. And even though we're talking a lot about here is how kind of min-maxing can get destructive to a game's culture, there still is a lot of people who play WoW or other games for intrinsic reasons. People raid even though they're not really enjoying the content, or it's kind of boring or easy for them, just because they like the conversations they're having with their guild and chat or the social aspect. And so, I would always say that you should always think about the intrinsic kind of systems and gameplay in the game as well. Don't always try to put carrots on a stick for everybody extrinsically. I think if the engagement, if you're just some race to keep everybody engaged with extrinsic motivators, I think you should think about, your intrinsic gameplay.
Yeah, and that leads into what an example I would give, and I'm gonna, take shots at WoW here. But the game design decision to make to formalize Gearscore in the game, right? Like I believe that has a culture impact on what's valuable in the game. Like Gearscore used to be an outside mod that people would get an add-on, that would help, people understand how geared they were amongst their communities because they were raid progressing or whatever it was. But once you formalize that, it tells everyone in the game that this is a valuable thing, that getting this number up is the way you progress properly in the game. And the example I was using before with the cosmetic or the fashion show, or fashion contest, that number is irrelevant for that group, right? What matters is, again, the subjective cosmetic, like how you're pairing your different pieces of equipment off each other to make for an amazing costume. But if you formalize item level or gear score, it sends a really strong cultural message from the designers to the community that this matters, right? And so that was one of the reasons we left that stuff out. We didn't put item level on our gear at the start of the game because we didn't want that to be the thing that people focus too much on. We wanted people to evaluate gear in a different way, and also just to not worry too much about how high that number was, essentially. So that is an example, I think, where game design can steer, the culture in a bad way, as opposed to leaving it more open-ended.
It sounds a lot like the reason my experience with WoW, at least with modern retail WoW, and why it's become so min-maxy is that you're heavily encouraged to chase this optimal, rewarding outcome of having solved for the best gear and knowing you can do the most damage as quickly as possible. And I feel like the reason so much emphasis gets put on that is because a lot of the other experiences of playing the game are just kind of thin. And if they weren't, you wouldn't really feel like it was as necessary to just power game that system. In single player games, like in Valheim, for example, I don't really feel tempted to sort of power game it because just being in the world and that act of actual exploration is rich. And the really crunchy gamers in Valheim are just fucking weird. I mean, we had somebody join the server that we were on, and this happened while I wasn't playing. This is like just a quick anecdote. But this person came in and they had clearly they were a power gamer and they had brought that mentality into Valheim, where I feel like it clashes. And like what happened was they completely redesigned sort of the base, and they let everybody know how the best layout was supposed to be. And they were already at like iron, within 2 days or something. And they had built a portal network to their advanced base. And in Valheim, it was easy to reject that kind of behavior because you're like, this person's just sort of spoiling it for us. There's no need to be this advanced. You're ruining everything. So we basically moved servers. We didn't tell them we had moved servers. And then we went to the game and destroyed the portal to their previous base. And that was that. We just sealed it off pretty much. We're like, no, sorry. And in modern WoW, I feel like the times where I have spent the least time focusing on all of those simmable min-max aspects has been when being out in the world and doing other stuff besides obsessing over gear has felt good. And I'm going to tell this, I've told Chris this a handful of times because he was directly involved and I wanted to thank him. But the most fun I think I've had in retail WoW in years was during actually Battle for Azeroth, if you can believe it. And during the open world, the assaults that came in 8.1 and all the world PvP that was just being encouraged by war mode and stuff. That was positive reinforcement of doing something besides obsessing over gear. That was basically putting in a system that made it more streamlined for you to find other people because you were put onto a shard with other people out in the world. And so your likelihood of having a world PvP encounter was higher. Then in 8.1, when they added these focus points for you to fight around and objectives and stuff, it was even higher then too. If you wanted to go out in world PvP, you suddenly knew kind of where you could do it pretty reliably. There were some rewards there, but the rewards became pointless really fast. And yet it was still fun to just hang out there and just play that kind of king of the castle. Like I've claimed basically this bluff in Borealis or outside of it with all of my friends, and we're just keeping the Alliance out for like 2 hours in a row. I mean, I would stay up till like 3 a.m, just blowing people off cliffs and just griefing, PvPing. It's a thin line, but I was having a blast and I didn't need to be sort of like getting anything out of it. I feel like that's the shaping approach I would more like to see from design, which is building something else up to be like, hey, go over here, this is fun, versus what I feel like is this negative reinforcement aspect that's happened a lot over the last few years, which is slowing the gameplay down, making the GCDs longer and putting them on more spots to make people feel like you don't need to be as twitchy. We're going to slow this down for you. We're killing the sugar rush a little bit. Basically bludgeoning covenants down until the effects between all of them are way, way less impactful than they would have been. They started out on this sort of give people this deep personal choice and you're going to commit to it. And then similar to Azerite powers, you introduce a new system and then you compromise on it by just kind of nerfing it into relative uselessness. And you're trying to basically tell people like, look, you don't even really need to sim because all these powers are supposed to be pretty much the same. So like, do you understand what I mean by sort of negative reinforcement there? It's like telling people that like you should pump the brakes as opposed to saying, here's somewhere else where you could step on the gas. You know what I mean?
And I think that's a perfect example like you're the same player, right? Like the experience you went from sort of elitist jerks, classic WoW, to Valheim, to the assaults, like you're the same person, and yet is the difference in the way you played and the enjoyment you got out of all three of those experiences a game design difference, or are there other external factors going on that are kind of, it's irrelevant? The game design is not playing a role in it at all, because I continue to feel like there's a game design element at play here that's made you play different and enjoy it differently, that we if we analyze it well, we can come to terms with what is it about the design that's changing these things, right? And we can put that into new games and different games to change the way people play and change the way the culture behaves and all that. So
well, they have this saying, it's like cities or communities or societies are judged by their tallest building. So if your tallest building is like Wall Street or something like that, well, clearly that's what your community, what your society really values the most. Right. And so if your game, you have to judge your game based on who are they rewarding the most, right? And so in WoW, of course, right, the ones who are rewarded the most are the kind of bleeding edge top percentile, Mythic Plus dungeon parties and raiders and arena players, right? And so that's what kind of creates that sort of environment and culture, right?
That's one axis, right? There are other axes, like Leroy Jenkins. Did he did the guys who made that video, did they win? I would argue absolutely, right? Like their prestige is through the roof, much higher than the average, raider. And that was a social one. It was a culture win, right? The guy who was leading, unsuccessful raids against Onyxia was yelling for more dots, like that guy won. But these are totally different, like, axes for, winning, essentially. And so what does the game reward, and what does the game support, and what does it encourage? How does it encourage players to, seek victories in different ways rather than, pushing everyone down the one path, and reinvesting in that one path?
Interesting here, because if we're talking about the problem of Discord and instant information transfer and players, supercomputing through stuff, there are like two solutions that have kind of come up so far. And one is, well, if we just make it unmathable, if we can somehow stay ahead of the players, then that's the sort of goal. And then the other solution seems to be like, well, let's just make the mathability less important by having other avenues that just don't really rely on math. I don't know. It seems like in the case of MMOs, and at least in WoW, the typical approach has been, well, we can get things more unmathable, and like we can stay ahead of the pack.
Right.
I don't know where I heard it. I remember some of the discourse around covenants early on, for example, being there are going to be so many permutations of conduits and soulbinds and everything that you could take. It's going to be so so complex that like no one's going to sim it. And what they will do is they'll give up on simming it and they'll just play. And then we will have really changed it. Like, I feel like that hope was there. And of course it didn't turn out that way. And then also you created this huge burden of complexity on yourself, such that like the only way you'll ever figure out what to do now is go to the sim, because there are a bajillion choices. Yeah. So like,
I mean, there's also this like really toxic line of thinking from system designers as well, which is just like, let's make it so impossible to sim and math out, then they won't even bother, right? But then I don't think that's ever the case. I think
I would never bet that horse.
Yeah. I mean, people have,
because even if it can't be mathable, like you're going to have someone make a claim. I did the math. This is the way forward, and everyone's going to believe it, right? Until the next person comes along and says, "No, this is the real math."
You have to assume that you're smarter than your player base to do that, to like really deliver on that, which is good luck for you, my dude.
Yeah, you're an individual versus the Borg. It's like good luck. I mean, Kevin, I don't think you answered your own question. What do you think? Do you think that games today can exist without really, like I said, competitive online multiplayer
Right.
games, MMOs, competitive PvP games like Apex, can they exist today without factoring in the Discord communities or whatever player communities, Reddits, mathing out the game?
Yeah, it's definitely a tough one. But I came here tonight with an idea that tries to leverage the power of Discord rather than being shackled by it. Right. So this is a random game idea. It's real simple. You're playing with like 100 players on a map, in a city map, right? And each of you are driving around in an ambulance, and you form little, guilds or whatever, where we're a company and we employ a bunch of ambulances, and the city generates emergencies essentially that you have to respond to. But the game UI doesn't tell you where the emergencies are. You might be near it, you might hear an explosion, you might see smoke. You have to through your senses or just observing, you have to see that something's going down. And then you get on the horn in Discord and tell the rest of your group this is happening, and the game rewards you based on the speed at which you respond to the thing and how well you accomplish the goals, which usually are either single or group based, and then you get points and stuff like that. And so this again tries to leverage like the speed of external communication essentially, because if you're a solo guy that's not in a group and you have no communication, you're going to have to get lucky to like be near the emergency in order to take care of it. So it's just kind of random idea to try to leverage what Discord does, sort of acknowledge that it exists and build gameplay around it, rather than again trying to like figure out how to outsmart Discord or prevent Discord from being harmful to the experience.
Mm-hmm. So what you're saying basically is to embrace it, and that's kind of the answer.
Like how can we? Is there a way to do that? Because I try to be optimistic, right? And every time somebody comes into my channel and they say, "Oh, you can't design things like that anymore because X, Y, Z," right? I'm always mad at it because it's like you're crushing some dreamer, and like realists always live in the here and now, and you can only take the world as it is, right? But the dreamers in us try to reject that, and they try to see what could be. And so I'm trying to appeal to the dreamers, of like, and that's what game designers a lot of times should be. They should be balanced, of course, with the realists, but it's like, let's give some power back to the dreamers and try to figure out what we can do with what the world is now. And so it's like, yeah, what can we do? What kind of games can we make? How can we improve the MMO space? Because this is obviously the most complex version of what we're talking about, to kind of embrace the way Discord is, rather than just kind of feeling like, ho-hum, we can't do anything.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I actually think a good example of this is Pokemon Go. Pokemon Go, there's a lot of communities built to kind of share information of where certain Pokemon live or, can be caught and where the raids are and how to do these things. And, there's not a lot of like kind of degenerative kind of mathing out in that community, I don't think. And
Right.
it kind of adds to the experience. It's kind of built with that in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so I definitely agree that going forward, we mentioned talking about the future. I definitely think what you mentioned in your game pitch idea, which is awesome, by the way, is basically, embracing the community aspect and the world we live in the game and the system design.
Right.
Well, and the common theme, to bring it back to what we said earlier, is that that's also a highly collaborative, cooperative game where you're not feeling like you're in competition with anybody else, either for friends or for loot. Like that model of a game, everybody wins when people work together.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
I was thinking briefly about my time in Guild Wars 2 back when. Like I played it a lot right around launch, and a few things that stuck out to me early on were one, anybody could go and resurrect anybody else, like kind of really at any time, and you got experience for doing it. And it was just like heavily encouraged to just like basically go and chuck somebody a res. And that was just a nice, subtle sort of like made the culture feel better type thing that I noticed in what was otherwise, I guess, kind of a competitive game. There weren't really damage meters. They also tried to break apart the Holy Trinity. I know that it came back to some degree, but it had the effect of like making me feel like in dungeons, like no one was really obsessing over my own performance, and it was just kind of on how I did, and it felt like a more like socialist take on the MMO genre. Like I don't really know how to explain it.
Yeah, where my mind too.
Yeah, totally. But then what I found is that in the end game, I completely fell off it because there was no way for me to make the numbers go up, and there was no real easy way for me to like demonstrate the ways in which I was competitive. I mean, there was PvP, which is most of what I did there, but I wasn't really good enough to distinguish it, so I quit and just gave that reason instead.
Like flex, and so they need that sort of they need that for all of their accomplishments. And I don't mean to crush the hopes of that group, because obviously we built WoW with that group in mind as well. But we built it for a lot of other types of players, and that's what I think. I think the issue for some games and some development teams is right now is that they're over focused on the performers and the achievers rather than a broader community.
Yeah.
It makes me think of like, is there an environment that you can create? But back to like socially engineering cultures or whatever. Mm-hmm. Is there an environment that you can create that cherishes the new player? Or rather, like, can you think of a time in your life that you did something with somebody else and it was made better by the fact that they had never done it before? Like, oh, I can't wait for you to see this movie that I fucking seen. I can't wait to see the look of joy on your face when you find out the plot twist. Or like, is there a way to tap into that kind of mentality and create a culture of people that can't wait to bring somebody new into an experience?
Yeah, they do it. They do it pretty obviously in Final Fantasy XIV. They have the whole sprout system that you get like a little leaf next to your name when you're a new player. And that does a lot of amazing work, because like if you're yelling at that guy for sucking, that's on you now, because he's obviously a leaf, right? So don't be a dick, right? Like it's one thing to talk to someone who isn't a leaf about their shitty damage or whatever, but it's another to pick on a new player. So of course some people will still do it, but so that does a lot of work there. And then they also just have the, someone in the group hasn't done this raid before, and everyone gets more stuff because of it. So
people and no.
are like, sweet, keep that guy around. I don't care if he does nothing. Just slug him in the corner, right? I'm benefiting. So that, they do it pretty heavy handed, but it does have some important, effects on the culture of that game.
It certainly does, and it certainly does lubricate those experiences. That the thing he's talking about is like when you have someone who's new to the zone, it'll tell the group when you get into it, like somebody in here hasn't done it, and people will be like, yay, because they get double the rewards that they care about. They're going to get double the points for doing that dungeon, which definitely lubricates it, but it still doesn't change the fact that it's very frustrating when you're doing a boss fight and that person didn't know that you have to step on this square at exactly this time. Right. And even though I told you, like, I don't think that the sprout next to your name really does anything. Having had it on my name many times now, which could also just be like how the sprout works. If you leave the game for 90 days and come back, you get the sprout, or you get the option to have the sprout. Mm-hmm. But also, like, I think the other thing that makes that game work is that you could technically get banned for bitching at someone about their damage.
Right.
Because you're not supposed to have damage meters in that game. And so if you were to be like, you did exactly 171k DPS, they'd be like, how do you know that? And it's like, well, because I'm running a bot that's telling me that. And it's like, now I can report you, asshole.
That's right. And that's another, like, I talked about the item level thing and the Gearscore thing, like, to formalize damage meters into an MMO, again, sends a really strong message that these are important, they should be used. And then, how does the culture respond to that? And we're like, well, this is the way by which I judge you. And if you're falling low, I'm going to let you have it. And it's tacit approval from the dev team, right? That's okay, because they've put it in the game for that very purpose, right? Is the assumption. So as opposed to Final Fantasy's approach, which is, don't download these. Do not bully people based on their performance. And we're going to ban you if you do. And those two different approaches can massively impact culture.
I was just going to add real quick, just a comment to kind of, because you did bring up like Gearscore, or not Gearscore, Radar.io, and that whole culture. I think that is kind of built upon to sort of, if you think about dungeons today in the game, which is versus, say in Classic, the intent with Mythic Plus is to do it, at a certain difficulty and at a certain speed. Whereas before it was more tactical and you could take your time, you just had to complete it, right?
Right.
And so it predicates and makes players care more about efficiency and damage, throughput,
Absolutely.
and things like that in the modern game versus before. And so
sure.
that is one way, of course, this sort of like min-max culture can be amplified by the developers, right?
Yeah. And they, what was I going to say? And for that group, it's a very effective tool. There it can be, at least. Like it's obviously not the whole picture, because player skill and all that, and group skill are huge variables on that. But for that group, it can be a great, opening tool to figure out who they should be grouping with. And so again, it's not like I hate that thing, like especially when that group uses it. But again, formalizing it in the game, I think, is a much bigger decision culturally than it is, like a gameplay decision.
Mm-hmm. And I kind of think you always have to decide, like, what is the game about? What is the vision here? What are we trying to do, about making this decision? If the game is supposed to be about kind of what, in its current state, about incentivizing this sort of, celebrating the high performing players in these systems, then yes, add Radar.io, because not having it is clunky, right? Absolutely. But if the vision of the game is different, then you have to reevaluate that, right? And
hey guys, I'm sorry, I have a hard stop at 7:00. Thanks for having me, and I hope you guys get around to taking questions. See ya.
See you later.
Oh yeah, by the way, if anybody, thanks Candace. If anybody in the audience here has a comment, the topic is game designing Discord and whether min-maxing by the community and re-engineering how the game works helps or hurts games, and how you view games will be impacted in the future by that. So
yeah, it seems like no hands. Yeah, quiet one. Oh, there we go. We got a hand. Welcome.
Hey, it's all your fault after you said no hands.
That's right.
Yeah, Kevin jinxed it. We're almost out of here.
Well, no, it's talking about incentivizing people. Absence is, I think, a great incentive. But to the point of Discord, you've mentioned some of the stuff that has to do with Discord is here to stay. Like, there's no way of getting around the way that the world is changing. So, I'm not a game designer, but I think about games a lot, and I'm hoping to figure out a way to work in that space in the future. And I think that by the time that I get to it, whether it's going to be in a month or in a year, the world is going to change once again. And the rules are going to change a little bit. Some of the stuff that's forever just about how humans work is not going to change, but the tools and the culture is going to shift.
Right.
So we have to move forward, and it's amazing that we're having this conversation. You guys are having the conversation. I get to listen to both your past experiences that I was not privy to Everquest or Ultima Online, and it's always nice to hear about what that was like. And like, I'm not playing Valheim right now, and I'm really excited to hear what people's experiences are. And on that note, my question / contribution would be in the footsteps of Pokemon Go and some of the stuff that I've been thinking about. Coming from advertising industry, there's this notion that you can show a different ad to a person every time that they interact with the system that creates the ad. So the ad never repeats itself. It's just always created for you on the spot. It's basically drawn like it would be drawn in Photoshop, but it's drawn while you're loading the page. The words are selected for you, the colors are selected for you, and you never see the same ad twice. That rise in computing power is another change in the way that we interact with the world and the tools that we have to build products and games. And what I think is that perhaps it doesn't make sense to vary the game in a way that nobody ever has the same experience twice, or nobody can share an experience, because then it becomes, well, I'm kind of assuming a multiplayer environment, so it becomes a single player game, even though there's a bunch of people in it. But perhaps there's a way to vary your experience from chapter to chapter so that you can come together because you need the same resource or you have a common objective, but your storylines differ, just like they differed in vanilla WoW. You would go to a dungeon and the gear was so different depending on what type it was or what class it was meant for, but you always had the goal of getting whatever the gear was best for you. And even if you didn't get it, you were able to partake in that experience, and then you went your separate ways to do other stuff. So going forward, could we create experiences that kind of shift around and change so that secret Discord cannot really exist because in its current form, because there is no set of rules. There's no the initial for the character that you need to input somewhere. It changes for every player, and sometimes it intersects, but you can't just look it up because your choices have shifted your storyline. And you know that in chapter 3 of that storyline, the game is designed to bring you together to fight a boss in a dungeon together so you can get a thing that everybody gets. And that's a way to bring people together and give them that shared experience and make friends. But then the choice after that and all of the choices before then will drive you to a new place where you will meet new people or you will spend some time by yourself. And there was, so I think
just to sum up what you're saying, I think, if in my interpretation is basically, is there a way to create future games based on, our increased technologies and computing power, et cetera, to kind of dynamically give you a different experience based on your unique sort of history in the game or whatever. And I think that's really fascinating. I'm sure there's games that exist like this. I can't think of one right now, but I think that's really interesting. And when we were talking about this problem or this issue earlier with Discord, etc., one option is always to kind of like fight against the currents of the community, and this is definitely one way you could do that.
Yeah, the problem is just quality control. Content being randomly generated. A lot of times the content quality is going to be all over the place. It's going to be very extremely varied, and there won't be anyone there to be the middleman between this is okay and this is not. So a lot of times you're going to get a bad experience, and sometimes you're going to get a good one. But the process that's randomly generating it isn't going to be able to tell the difference. It's just going to be churning out stuff, right? Content. And so that's why a person has to be involved in order to take charge of the quality control. But also just to speak of reward structures, it's the difference between Diablo 2 and World of Warcraft or EverQuest or most MMOs. A lot of the loot is targeted, where it's where things are. And so if you're interested in chasing after certain rewards, you can go specifically to those places. If you can't figure out where to go, or there isn't a specific place to go, then then the community tends to narrow it down to the most efficient, drop rate. So in Diablo 2, it was Mephisto runs, right? People would just repeat that over and over and over. And there are examples of this in WoW, in WoW's history as well. I think they had a time when it was more random. Everyone figured out the fastest way to get the job done was a specific dungeon, so they ran that dungeon over and over. And so you have to be really careful with just spreading out, the rewards too much or making them too random, because then it's just a question of how fast can I get, the treasure chest.
Right. Okay. Well, let's. I guess we could wrap things up. It's been an hour now, and so I hope a really great conversation, though, Kevin. I love this topic idea. We should have Kevin make more topic ideas.
I'll try. I responded almost at the very last minute because I was just drawing blanks for so long. But then this one kind of came up in my Twitch chat, as we were talking. And there's also a great video called MMO Social to Solo. I can't remember who did it, but it's MMO Opinion. And it kind of reinforced this idea of like the culture has shifted. And so, yeah, can we shift it back through game design, or are we just at the mercy of how things are changing? You know, because obviously the real world bleeds over into gaming, you know, social structures. So, yeah, can we play a role in steering it, or yeah, we just have to take it as it comes? Mm-hmm. And I'm a game designer, so I'm biased, but I feel like we have the power to steer it in places, and I'd like to see us trying that more often.
Yeah, and I think, there's a whole other adjacent sort of conversation that's related to this as well, which impacts kind of the culture and the motivations for the player that we've been talking about, is when the game goes from making it so that you're in a community and people that you are playing the game with add to your experience and help you. And there's a culture of or kind of engineered interdependence among players. The motivations for the player change when it becomes more motivated by the individual player's kind of power gains and thinking about themselves as, being basically playing the game like a single player game in a world sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And so that definitely does shift things as well. And it changes the whole it brings it away from being a lot of intrinsic things about the community to more extrinsic about my own power level versus everybody else. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's the single think instead of the group think.
But within a competitive game still. I feel like this would not be... There's a game for everybody now, right? The long tail effect is well into effect. And besides discoverability issues, you can find something generally that suits your taste, I think, in games. But the problem is that the MMO genre is so notoriously large and expensive that there's kind of only room, it feels like, to sustain so many of them. And so the few lightning rods that are there have to cater to so many different types. So it's not just as simple as saying, here's my super crunchy MMO where we've just let the meta run rampant and everything is as simmable and nerdy as you want. And here's your one that's a little more chilled out. And the designers encourage that. In the specific case of WoW, we're asking them to sort of... There's a line that Ian floats in these interviews all the time about how many different audiences WoW has to serve. And I feel like sometimes that can be a bit of a shield over design decisions that you can't really question them, because you have to think, well, there's probably an audience that does appreciate this change. But it really, I think it does really ring true. The difficulties of shifting the culture like this, it wouldn't even be considered a thing you'd need to do, in other games, or if there were more offerings, or I think it really bottlenecks within the MMO genre just because of the amount of options that are available there. And that just kind of occurred to me as we're tailing out.
Right.
All right, let's close this thing out.
All right.
Kevin, Luca, always been a good topic, good discussion. And to Kevin's viewers, if you want to come on here and ask a question, you go to theorycraft.club, and the directions are there. You can figure out how to come on here and ask a question if you want. All right, cool. Thanks, everyone. Until next week.
All right. See you all next week.
Guys.
Bye.
Later.